it or not, we're already in a new year and we're kicking things off with Security North and South. So we had a great first year and a lot of great comments, a lot of great feedback on some of the recaps that we've done. But what's been happening with you here in the first part of the year?
Yeah, how quickly time goes, Eddie. I was expecting a little cupcake with a candle, a little single
Yeah,
candle on there to kind of really get us going. But
yeah, that
we'll
my
have to do
fire
that.
insurance provider wouldn't allow it. So you know how these legal guys are.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, no, we'll do that for a year too, but we'll do it outside, in Canada in January. So there's a little risk of fire. Yeah, thrilled with year one. I mean, it was a ton of fun. And like you said, great conversation, great topics, good guests, great guests, I should say. So lots of fun. And we're starting to roll in 2023 with a fellow Canadian. We figured we'd go 2-1 right off the get go. And Graham Hussey's joining us today. We're going to be talking about software as a service in the security world, the security space, and specifically, of course, security services. And Graham's got a wealth of experience, on the client success side, on the product side, and working in multiple industries too. So get a
Yeah.
little bit of a comparison between industries from Graham.
Yeah, and I thought this was a great conversation. Graham makes some really great points about software as a service and really the security industry as a whole and how we view technology. So, again, thank you to all those who follow us, all those that have given us comments and listened to the podcast. This year we have some great topics and guests lined up. We're going to dig into some things that may be a little non-traditional when it comes to security, mental health, work-life balance, for example. We're going to be talking to some security industry personalities and really diving into a lot of topics that we're really excited about diving into. So thanks again for following and enjoy this first episode with Graham Hussey. Great conversation. Hope you enjoy it. Well, welcome to another episode of Security North and South. Mark, here we are in 2023 in our first episode. So tell us who our first guest of the year is.
Great to see you, Eddie. Eddie, we're starting in the north this year. It's a
Ah,
first for us. Starting a new year up north. Joining us today, Mr. Graham Hussey. Graham and I worked together a few years ago now, but him and I were speaking in. Graham, keep me honest here. I guess the fall of last year, we got into this whole thing about software as a service and tech change and client success and all that kind of stuff. And as he was telling me, kind of sharing his insight and info with me, I thought, man, this would be a great topic for Security North South. I mean, 'cause it impacts security businesses, it impacts customers, that are receiving security services and so on. So, Graham, welcome to Security North South, and thanks for joining us today.
Oh, welcome. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, right on. We're gonna start. We're gonna put you right on the spot, and we're gonna give us a bit of an intro. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and share what you want.
I'll make it short and sweet. Born and raised in Montreal, Canada. So, north and right now in January, obviously living with our Canadian weather. So it's a bit of a fresh air to speak with you guys and hear a little bit more from Eddie about how he's not freezing. Um, Father of two young kids. And, I guess what brought me here today is really I stumbled into SaaS and security a little bit by happen chance a few years ago. And just got me hooked on, how to bridge that gap between people and technology. And it was really interesting speaking with you about it back in November. And I think it's great to talk about it a bit more today.
Love it. Thanks for joining us, Eddie. You wanna hit him with the My Security story?
yeah, I'm going to do that. But first, let me lodge an official objection. The first episode of the year, and I'm already outnumbered. So two north versus one south. But yeah, Graham and I were talking before we started recording here and swapping weather stories. And I'd shared with him if what was happening down here is the same thing that's happening up there with his weather, we would shut the place down for months at a time. So just a different perspective from the north and the south. But Graham, we did launch something last year. And by the way, Mark, I haven't shared this with you yet, but we've gotten a few thousand views of just over this one topic because people are really hungry not just to receive the stories, but also to share their
Share.
stories.
Yeah.
But something called hashtag my security story, whether you've been doing this for 20 years or just a couple of months, we're always curious what brought you into the security industry. So Before we go any further, let's hear Graham's hashtag My Security story. How did you get involved in the security industry?
I had been working in sales and marketing for about a decade, and a few former colleagues of mine had started working for a software startup in Montreal. And this startup was focused on how to kind of revolutionize the workforce management space, specifically for security companies. So I sat down, I was given a little demo of the software, and one of the things that jumped out at me was I just deployed this workforce management software for marketing companies. And here this little company had a product that was already, leagues and miles ahead of what we had deployed. And that was a big firm that, had big wallets and was able to develop, what was supposed to be a great product. So I took a leap. I joined as an account manager at the time. And I really hope that my previous experience in kind of technology and working with customers was enough to make up for that gap in, not having any knowledge about security or how these companies operate. I think one of the things that I was really lucky about was the fact that I was able to take the first 6 months and just email and call every customer that we had. Not focused on selling them anything, not focused on presenting anything, but really just to understand, what is it that you do? How do you operate? The software that we sell you, does it work? Does it not work? What value does it bring? And where do we fall a bit short? And that gave me that chance to really kind of make the connections between my previous experiences and start understanding a little bit more about security. So I was able to connect the dots with some of that marketing experience. And then after that, being a startup, I think it was 10 or 12 employees at the time, I was exposed to just about everything across the business. And I had this opportunity to start working a little bit closer with the engineers and those who are building the software. And I realized that, my motivation really came from starting to understand what was going on from a customer's perspective, and then how do you deliver a solution, right? And sometimes the solution is building something. Sometimes the solution is tweaking something. Sometimes the solution is education. And I think for me, that was just such a great moment of realization that it was like, I can actually find fun in this, and I can really dig into it. So I started really focusing a bit more on that, got into the product space, started working with engineers, always kept my hands in the customer side of things, and always stayed close with a few customers. But I had a chance to jump back in on the customer side. And when I did, I think one of the benefits I had was understanding how the technology works and understanding what you can do and what you can't do. But then also being able to bring that to a customer and clearly explain it and ask the right questions. Really gave me an up, on both sides of the business. And like I said, I was able to kind of bridge that gap. And I think that's where my passion in both security and tech comes from.
Yeah, that's really cool, Graham. Thank you. And one of the things that Eddie and I, we try to kind of focus on and dive into a little bit more is the business of security as opposed to the security of business, right? So it's going to be really interesting as we kind of get into the couple of questions that we have for you here, and when we talk a little bit more about the business side. And with that in mind, you've been a SaaS, software as a service tech guy for years, connecting, helping, enabling, different companies implement systems. You did that at the software company that you were just describing, starting your security experience. You did it before, and you did it after. But from your perspective, how would you say it was different when you were applying those solutions to security businesses or in a security service setting?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that stood out to me when I was sitting down and trying to summarize all of this is, you always hear customers will always talk about the what. So when I was speaking with security companies, it was always, we need this, right? And they're focused on this, on the what. I really learned how to understand the why, and you need to get to the why, because asking somebody what is a really easy question. But if you just base yourself off of what they tell you, you're going to have gaps. There are things that you're going to miss. There's misunderstandings between them and you. And I think specifically from security company standpoints, me not coming from security, there were things I didn't understand. So I just had to constantly dig and ask more and get to the root. So it helped me come back with a better solution, but it also helped me to start thinking ahead. So I wasn't just coming back saying, hey, this is, what you need. I started coming back saying, hey, you told me that this is why you're looking for it. Here's the solution I propose. And did you think about these other 5 or 6 things? And that just, brought up more conversations, and it started getting deeper into the whole thing.
Yeah. And sorry, Eddie, I was going to say that the how would be different too, right? I mean, the how would be completely different amongst, whether it's an end user, whether it's a security service company, that kind of thing. But sorry, Eddie, I cut you off.
No, you're on the same track. And when it comes to our industry, I think you touched on a very good point. A lot of times our problem is not how much data we have. I was actually having a conversation with a colleague this morning that we live in a very fortunate time where we have access to all kinds of different data points. In fact, we're flooded sometimes with data as an industry. To me, the challenge in the next few years is what do you actually do with that data? And why is it meaningful, and how can it be beneficial to that end user? So I see a lot of times where people fail when it comes to software as a service or tech in general as to what solution are you really bringing to the table. And one of the things we've talked about here on this podcast, and certainly in general in the industry, is sometimes the end user, the security company, for example, or even the end user of the security company services, doesn't always know they need a solution, if that makes any sense. And I think guys such as yourself, you probably have had a challenge in the past actually convincing people that they have a problem they don't even know about. So what challenges do you see in the security industry convincing people that they have to go down a certain road that they're not even sure they need to go down?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, one of my, I guess an example I can come up with that came up quite often was if you take a company that's working with paper and pen, it's a process that has been working for years. They built their business off of it. That's how they've always delivered information to customers. They've been able to operate that way. And when you start talking about implementing a software, rolling out a solution, it's not just a matter of, what do we buy and where do we put it, right? Now it comes into how do we get everybody to want to adopt this? How do we actually get everybody interested in this? So that work that, let's say somebody in sales would do to sell an executive on this idea of understanding overtime and how to reduce overtime, you now need to figure out how can you actually approach one of the security guards, or how can you approach the customer or the client of a security company and provide them with some type of value from this as well. And I really think, one of the things I learned with security companies was take that time to dig into it. Everybody loves to talk about how they operate and what they do. I know there's some secrets that people don't want to share, but everybody does like to talk about it. And if you invest that time in understanding, what they used to do, what they're doing today, and where they want to go, you're going to come up with a better solution. Whereas if you just ask, what is it that you want? And then you tell them, hey, this is your option. You're not necessarily seeing some of these other opportunities that you have.
Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, you just don't know, right? And you don't know what you don't know, and you take it from there. And it's funny, and one of the things that I've found, in change in general, right, whatever disruption and change is, people are really good at a certain process, right? They're really good at it. And they can take it from A to B to C to D, but just because you're really good at a process doesn't make it the best process that's there, or even that's possibly available. It comes back to that comment about you don't know what you don't know. So Graham, you've done a bunch of different roles. You've done sales, account management, support, client experience. You've done product work. You've done really that kind of whole range. So this is a 2-part question. Define client success from Graham Hussey's point of view, and what kind of advice do you give to someone who's like, okay, hey, I need to digitally disrupt my business. I've never done it before. So what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think, one of the first things to touch on there is, we hear these terms, especially in SaaS. It's starting to bleed into other industry now, but we hear about CS, customer success. We hear about CX, customer experience, things like customer journey and user experience. And I think everybody who reads these terms or hears these terms, they have a certain understanding of them. And I'd argue that even within a tech company, you have different understandings by different departments or different roles. when I look at, customer success high level, it's really something that's across the organization. It's ultimately, how do you make the customer successful? And therefore, if the customer's successful, you should be successful in your relationship with them. And when I think about customer experience, same thing. It's ultimately from day one, when they first, let's talk about a security company, when they first decided that they were looking to hire security services, all the way until the first evaluation that they've done with a company, and until they switch to another company, right? This is that experience that they're going to have with your company, and you need to align everybody together on this. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that customer success as a term, showed up in the late 90s. It was something that was really tech related. It's grown exponentially over the last few years. And I think that there is still a disconnect in that understanding from a customer's perspective, a salesperson's perspective, someone who's working as a customer success manager, or, an end user. In this case, it could be a security guard. So first step is really, let's all be on the same page, which is that this doesn't belong to one person. This belongs to the organization as a whole. Second piece is, you have to be open to changing this up. What I learned with security companies is what works for one does not necessarily work for another. And what I've learned in technology is the same thing. Just because, some of the big guys out there have done something and grown because of it, doesn't mean that, you in your industry or your vertical is going to be able to accomplish the same thing. And then getting a bit more granular, I think, in addition to not copying and pasting what you've seen elsewhere, it's now a matter of, how do you start to tailor this to your customers? So what are you looking for? Who are you listening to? And I think the answer there is, you're listening to everybody, because every bit of feedback you get is valuable. But you need to decide what's actionable and what isn't. And that's a tricky decision to make. But you need to start being able to make those decisions, and you need to work quickly, and mistakes will happen, and that's perfectly fine. You just kind of roll with it and adjust as you go.
Yeah, and to that point too, and this is not just specific to the security industry, but when you're talking about technology, software as a service, et cetera, in 2023, we are dealing with so many different systems, so many different data dumps, so to speak. And even in future episodes, we'll be talking about work-life balance in the security industry, because it's 24/7 and things are coming at you a million miles an hour. Do you see a challenge still with trying to converge, for lack of a better word, all these different technologies, sort of where they are talking to each other and they marry each other up? Because one of the biggest obstacles when we talk about security technology, it's going to be one more domain I've got to visit, one more thing I've got to actually deal with, versus how does it actually start to work in tandem with each other? So what do you see? And by the way, up in the north, as Mark said, they do 2-part questions. Down in the south, we're not smart enough to do that, so we just do a 1-part question. But do you see a challenge when it comes as software as a service, a pushback going, hey, all these different things need to talk to each other?
Well, I think regardless of what software you're implementing, you have to think of it a little bit as an iceberg, right? You're seeing that tip that's sticking out, and you're saying, okay, this software is going to give me X, Y, Z, right? Or this hardware, it could be cameras, it could be phones, it could be anything. Yeah. But you need to understand that 9/10 of it is actually under the water. So how is that going to speak with another solution? Who's involved in rolling this out? What's the learning curve like? Even forgetting the learning curve, what is your actual adoption going to be? Because you have, let's say a site supervisor, if they don't see the value in something, they're not going to be speaking with the guards about it to help them understand, how it's beneficial to them. So you really need to take a step back, I think, and say, where is it that we're trying to go? What are all these components that come together? And when do we bring the different components in? And then you start diving into, how do they actually speak to each other? Yeah. What are those limitations, or what are those benefits that we get from each and every one?
Right from product design too, right? And then trying to take into account, these perceptions that you touched on it, right? Perception that different groups have: customer, frontline employee, manager, supervisor, business owners, and so on. What are all of their perceptions? And if we don't sort of address them, they individually become, maybe competing, whether they're not sort of brought together.
Yeah, I mean, like I remember there were a number of situations where, we're looking at a certain feature or we're thinking of a certain idea, and you start to speak with different security companies and get their idea of it and understand how they operate today. And you start to quickly learn that, it could be a geographical reason that this is different. It could be a market or a customer differentiation that's forcing you to do something different. It could literally just be that they've never been exposed to another way of working. And all of this needs to be factored into that decision making. And I think one of the keys at least it's the example I used to use is, a company like Facebook could roll out an update tomorrow and you've got hundreds of millions of people that see that update immediately. In the security world, you can't do it that way. And that's just because the way the customers work, the way the security companies work, the way the guards work, there's so much involved that you need to think this through before you implement a change. And that could be from a technology standpoint. It could just be from, your SOPs. If you're changing your SOPs, you've got to know how to go about affecting that change.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point too, is you have to know the why. You have to know what goal we're trying to get to. And one of the things that I've seen as a challenge as well is you have to spend the time on the front end to reap the benefit on the back end. And so that is part of the investment up front, is doing it right the first time. And I was talking to another colleague earlier this week as well about timekeeping systems. And you mentioned early on in our conversation about even going from pen and paper to electronic reports, timekeeping, et cetera. We sit here today and think, well, that's been around for a while. And if you look at history, we were doing it the same way for literally thousands upon thousands of years. And just sort of not too many decades ago did we start to talk about doing it in a different way. But this colleague had told me that he had recently gone to electronic timekeeping, but he was still keeping the written timesheets just as a backup. And, and one of the things, and I said this in a very diplomatic, gingerly way to him, was, well, you've certainly got a lot more time than most people do, because that's, first of all, very inefficient. Because one of the reasons we go to this is for accuracy, to make sure that it's complete, but also it's more efficient, it's more timely. So if we're replicating processes down the road, you're not really having that why, that goal in mind of what you're really trying to accomplish. So one of the things that we talk about in these episodes is, where are we going in the future? So do you see a lot more adoptability, a lot more embracement in the security industry when it comes to software as a service, or where do you see things head in the next 5 or 10 years?
It's a great question. I was surprised at how quickly things had evolved, just in those few years that I was working on the tech side specific to security. I think the last 3 years have probably helped accelerate that as well. With, people working from home, with everything else that went on, I think there was an even further push, or a faster push to kind of affect some change there. Nowadays as well, we're starting to see the technology is a lot easier for people to pick up. And I think that's making a big difference, not to mention that the costs are lower. I think the one challenge that we may foresee is that we're starting to see, so many different products come out at the same time that sometimes it's hard to differentiate between, what's that tried, tested, and true evolution versus what's that new thing that might end up being a gimmick. And only time will tell, what plays out there. But I've been seeing it a lot on the consumer tech side, and I'm sure it's happening on the security side as well.
Yeah, trend versus fad, right, Eddie? I mean, you wrote a piece about that recently, and the other piece, I think, kind of adding to Graham's comment about the impact down the road, complexity. Right. I mean, on the security service side, whether that's payroll complexity, HR complexity, legislative complexity, client service delivery complexity, lack of resources, and so on. I think it's really kind of forcing us to look at things in a different way. Yeah, maybe a parting question for me, and Eddie, I don't know if you've got another one too, but Graham, how would you compare? You've done multiple industries, right? You've spent quite a bit of time in different ones. But so how do you compare the security industries versus the other one? Now, don't name any names. Don't get angry at anybody.
You can tell
But
us names after we stop recording. We'll be
yeah,
glad
after
to
we
take
stop
names.
recording,
So.
we can do that for another hour. But so how would you say that the security industry is different from the other ones?
I think at the end of the day, when you're presenting any solution to anyone and you're delivering on that solution, there are a lot of similarities. I think back to starting in retail electronic sales, and someone comes in to buy a computer, to buy a piece of networking equipment. You start with the same kind of questions. You start to get to the bottom of it. I think the difference with security is that there was at one point a larger hesitation to change. And I think that hurdle has been kind of passed now, and we're starting to see it happen faster. I would also argue that, on the consumer side of things, people tend to want to change quickly and quite often. And I think on the security side of things, we don't necessarily see the need to change just for the sake of change. So where it gets a little bit more challenging in security is knowing, when to make that change. When has the reasoning behind the change started to really force you to have to affect the change? And on the flip side, when do you, start to look ahead and to know when you should make that change, before everybody else is going to do it? Because it is a differentiator in this market to be able to say that, you offer A, B, C, or X, Y, Z that somebody else doesn't.
Nice.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect way to put it, is the industry sometimes is slow to adapt because they want to see that proof of concept. They want to see, is it actually working? How does it benefit? And as you put it very well, we've seen an acceleration of that in the past 2 or 3 years because, in my opinion, the industry is starting to embrace the technology because they are seeing how it can improve our services, make us more efficient. And one of our previous guests that we have to credit with this line said, it's going from the fear of being first to the fear of actually missing out on what everyone else is taking advantage of. So, Graham, great insights. I think you've summed up a lot of the issues we've been talking about as an industry when it comes to software as a service and other technology. So, can't thank you enough for your time. Great first guest for the first year, Mark.
We're rolling. 2023 is going to be ours, guys. Graham, thanks very much. Great reconnecting with you just last fall, and then thanks again. Thanks so much for being on with us today.
Thank you both.